For 35 years, he forbade her from going up to the attic. But after his death, she went up there and discovered the truth that turned her whole life upside down. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The house had stood for decades at the end of a narrow lane just past the edge of town, where the maples grew wild and the wind carried the scent of soil and magnolia in the spring. Its brick walls bore the stains of time, and the windows, though clean, always seemed to wear a faint film of memory, as if the house itself remembered too much. To most, it was just another aging Southern home, respectable, well-worn, and half-forgotten. But to Lucille, it was where her whole life had unfolded, year after year, season after season, bound to the man she had followed there and the silence they had shared. She had arrived in that house 35 years ago, a city girl from Baltimore with ambitions she couldn't quite name, and a strength she had learned to hide behind polite smiles and pressed blouses. When James brought her down to Georgia, she thought it would be temporary, an experiment in quiet living, a compromise for love. But the land had a way of settling into her skin, and the slow rhythm of the countryside lulled her into staying. Back then, she had been drawn in by James's steadiness, by his gentle demeanor and the quiet certainty in the way he carried himself. He was a man who rarely raised his voice, who measured his words like carefully laid bricks, and who looked her in the eye when he promised anything. She had never known someone so unshakably reliable. James had inherited the house from his father, and though it wasn't large or elegant, it had been built with care, a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and a screened-in back door that always slammed a little too hard. The kitchen smelled of pine and spice, and the floorboards creaked in familiar places like a house clearing its throat. Lucille remembered the first time she stepped through the front door. It had been late spring, the dogwoods in full bloom, and James had carried her suitcase inside without saying a word. She had wandered from room to room, imagining the life they would build together. Sunday dinners, morning coffee, books stacked on every surface. It felt new, brimming with possibility. But amid that hopeful quiet, one detail stood out, one that would follow her through every year of their marriage: the attic. The hatch to the attic sat flush with the ceiling in the hallway outside their bedroom, an unassuming square of pale wood with a brass latch and a cord that dangled just low enough to brush against taller guests. On their second day in the house, Lucille had looked up at it and asked, half joking, what secrets he kept up there. James's face had changed subtly but unmistakably. He'd said calmly that she shouldn't go up there, that it wasn't safe. Weak beams, dusty boxes, maybe even mold. The kind of place you could fall through and break something. She hadn't pressed. It had been early in their life together, and she hadn't wanted to start their story with a challenge. She nodded and smiled and moved on to unpacking dishes. But from that moment on, the attic had become a quiet fixture in her mind, a presence above her head that she couldn't see but always knew was there. Over the years, the house became theirs in the way homes do after decades of living. Pictures found their places on walls. Rugs faded in patches from where the sunlight always hit them. The back garden, once a mess of weeds and clay, bloomed under Lucille's care. Life settled into its patterns: morning toast and jam, trips into town for groceries, evenings spent on the porch with the radio murmuring in the background. James worked at the small engine repair shop just off the highway, the same place his father had worked, and his hands always bore the dark stains of oil and grit. He came home at 6:30 every evening, washed up in the mudroom sink, and changed into soft cotton shirts that smelled faintly of motor grease and pine soap. He was never late. He never forgot to lock the doors. He never left without saying goodbye. They did not fight. not in the way people expect. There were no slammed doors, no cruel words. There were disagreements, certainly, about money, about the stubbornness of their aging water heater, about whether to repaint the kitchen cabinets, but even those ended in weary compromise, a quiet surrender to routine. Lucille often thought of their marriage as a dance on worn floorboards, predictable, practiced, but not without grace, and yet the attic remained untouched. Years passed, and Lucille came to regard the attic less as a mystery and more as a sealed room in a museum, a place too fragile to disturb. Still, she couldn't help noticing the way James occasionally glanced upward in the hallway, his eyes lingering on the hatch as if measuring something. On rare nights, when she awoke in the small hours and reached across the bed to find his side empty, she would hear the faintest sounds overhead, the creak of a board, the rustle of fabric. When he returned, he never explained, and she never asked. She told herself that everyone needed a place of their own. James had never been a man of many words, but he had always been honest. If he said it wasn't safe, then it wasn't safe. And perhaps he needed that space the way she needed her morning walks or her herb garden, something just hers or just his. But the unease remained, a gentle hum in the background of their life. The years gathered quietly. Lucille marked them in layers, holidays, funeral services, the changing of the porch cushions each spring. Her hair grayed early, and she cut it shorter every few years until it no longer reached her shoulders. James developed a limp after slipping on ice one winter and never fully recovered, though he rarely complained. Their habits grew fixed, their world shrinking gently inward like a drawstring pulled tight. People in town began to refer to them as the Brookses, a single unit. They always came to church together, always sat near the back, always left before the closing hymn. When someone's car wouldn't start, they called James. When the community center needed a batch of cornbread, Lucille baked 3 pans. Their life was good, solid, but never expansive, and always above them the attic waited. It wasn't until the 22nd year of their marriage that Lucille allowed herself to admit that something about the attic haunted her. Not in a ghostly way, not with fear, but with a slow, steady ache, the sense that she was kept from a part of the man she loved. She had never opened the hatch. She hadn't even tried, but the fact that it was there, always closed, always just overhead, had become a quiet ache in her ribs. When the neighbors talked about renovating, about opening up second floors or turning attics into guest rooms, Lucille would nod politely and change the subject. Sometimes she dreamed of climbing the ladder, of finding boxes of old photographs, perhaps letters. A few times she even stood beneath it, staring upward, hand hovering near the cord, but she never pulled it, and so it remained. The attic grew dusty with her silence and sacred with her restraint. On the surface, nothing ever changed. James came home at 6:30. Lucille laid out dinner. They watched the news in soft recliners, spoke softly of the day's events. But underneath, something in her yearned to understand what lived above them, not out of suspicion, but out of longing. She didn't want secrets between them, but she had learned that love sometimes meant allowing them to exist. So she smiled and nodded and dusted the baseboards. She hummed while folding laundry and trimmed the hedges each weekend. She placed fresh flowers in the hallway below the attic hatch, arranging them carefully like offerings. And the years continued on, quiet as breath. When the trees began shedding early one autumn, and the air turned sharp in the evenings, Lucille found herself standing once more beneath the hatch. The hallway was dim, the air still. She stared upward, heart heavy with questions too old to ask. She placed a hand on the wall to steady herself, not from dizziness, but from something deeper, a gathering inside her, as if a door within had begun to rattle in its frame. She didn't know yet what it meant. She didn't yet understand that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. But she would. One day, soon. Because even a silence, carefully kept for decades, must eventually meet its voice. The first time Lucille truly allowed herself to imagine a child in the house, it was after their third wedding anniversary. They had gone into town that morning for groceries, as they always did on Saturdays, and at the checkout counter of the small store near the courthouse, she saw a young mother with a child perched on her hip. The child had big brown eyes and stubby fingers that clung tightly to the collar of the woman's shirt. The mother didn't say much, just smiled softly at the cashier as she paid, but something about the weight of that little hand, the way the child leaned into her like they shared one heartbeat, stayed with Lucille for the rest of the day. When they got home, while James was unloading the trunk, she stood in the kitchen with a bag of flour in her arms and stared out the window at the empty yard. Her fingers curled instinctively around the bag, and for a fleeting moment, she imagined it as the weight of a small body, warm and breathing. They never sat down to plan. There were no solemn discussions or lists of names. It began with a shared look one evening when she rested her head against his shoulder on the porch swing, and he placed his hand over hers and left it there a moment longer than usual. It was a quiet kind of agreement, the way most things were between them, a gentle nudge toward the possibility of more. In those early months, Lucille existed in a state of cautious anticipation. She drank fewer cups of coffee, read articles about prenatal vitamins, and began noticing every baby in church, every stroller on the street. The idea of motherhood felt both impossible and intimate, like a melody she almost remembered. She didn't tell anyone they were trying. Not her friends from the library, not the neighbor 2 houses down who had 5 kids and an open porch. It felt too private, too tender to share. Time passed. She bought her first pregnancy test with trembling fingers and carried it home in a brown paper bag tucked beneath a carton of eggs and a loaf of rye bread. The result was negative. She told herself it was just too early. They tried again. Another month, another test, another blank window. She stopped taking the tests after a while. She couldn't bear the silent verdict anymore, the way each stick seemed to measure not biology, but hope. James never made her feel at fault. He never said a word to suggest blame, but he also never said much of anything. When she brought up doctor visits, he agreed, nodded, drove her when needed, but his face remained unreadable, his body present, but his thoughts far off. In waiting rooms, he sat with his hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on the posters on the walls, illustrations of embryos, fetal development timelines, smiling couples with pastel-filtered babies. Lucille filled out the paperwork. James simply signed where needed. They went to specialists in Macon and then in Atlanta. They heard the phrase unexplained infertility more times than she could count. It was a clinical kind of cruelty, to be told that nothing was wrong and yet nothing was right. They both passed every test, checked every box, and still the months drifted past without result. Lucille began to shrink from her own reflection. Her body, once something she had trusted without question, now seemed uncooperative, foreign. She wondered if James felt the same disillusionment. If, in the quiet spaces between them, he too carried the ache of absence. But he never said. He came home from work, kissed her cheek, and ate dinner as if the unspoken grief was just another part of the furniture in their house. Eventually, the silence between them became its own language. She stopped counting days, stopped circling dates on the calendar. The ache dulled but never left. It lingered in the background like the low hum of the refrigerator, present only when she paused long enough to hear it. She folded laundry, cooked meals, pruned the hedges. She did everything as before, only now with a weight in her chest that no amount of routine could lift. James retreated further into himself. He still brought her tea in the mornings, still fixed things around the house, but there was a stillness to him now, a quiet that ran deeper than usual. Sometimes she'd catch him staring out the window at the tree line, his expression distant. Other times she'd wake in the early hours to find him gone, only to hear the soft groan of the back door a few minutes later. He always returned silently, and she never asked where he went. The question felt too fragile, as if to ask would be to break the only thing holding them together. One day, about 6 years into their marriage, Lucille bought a crib. She told herself it was on impulse, but she had passed it in the thrift store 3 times before finally going in. It was simple. White wood, worn at the corners, the kind that creaked when rocked. She had it delivered while James was at work and stored it in the back room, behind the shelves where they kept boxes of old books and winter coats. She never mentioned it to him. Occasionally, when she was alone, she would pull off the cloth draped over it and run her fingers along the rail. Then she would cover it back up and leave the room. They never spoke of adoption. The subject floated between them sometimes, ghost-like, but neither reached for it. Perhaps they both feared what it might stir. The years had taught them to coexist with their sorrow, to tuck it neatly into corners and step around it like a loose floorboard. They did not argue, not about this. They simply let the silence grow roots. Lucille began working part-time at the library downtown. The quiet suited her. She liked the smell of old books, the order of shelves, the hush that fell over the building like a soft blanket. She organized community events, helped elderly patrons with large print requests, and occasionally read stories to children. Those days were the hardest. The sound of small voices, the slap of little feet on linoleum. It pierced her carefully constructed calm like sunlight through a shutter. She always smiled, always thanked the parents, but when she got home she would sometimes sit in the kitchen long after dinner, fingers wrapped tightly around a lukewarm cup of tea, and stare at nothing. James continued on, unchanged in his rhythms. He fixed things. He oiled hinges, patched the roof, replaced the gutters. He filled his time with repairs, and Lucille filled hers with schedules. They coexisted, 2 lines running parallel, never quite touching. The attic loomed larger in those years. Lucille found herself watching the hatch more often, her eyes drawn to it with something akin to longing. She never touched the cord, never pulled, but the air beneath it always felt heavier, as if the wood above held not just insulation and dust, but something deeper, history, grief, the residue of dreams deferred. One afternoon, while cleaning the hallway, she moved a step stool beneath the hatch and stood on it just to dust the ceiling. Her hand brushed the edge of the latch, and for a split second, she imagined pulling it down. But she stopped herself. Her heart beat too fast. She climbed down slowly and put the stool away, embarrassed by her own trembling. Later that week, she mentioned the attic casually at dinner, just to see what James would say. He didn't look up from his plate. Said it wasn't a place she needed to worry about. Said there wasn't anything up there worth fussing over. His voice was even, but there was a finality in it. She nodded. They moved on. Still, the presence of the attic became almost physical in her life. She avoided walking beneath it at night. She caught herself glancing up when passing by. In her dreams, she often found herself standing before it, key in hand, the wood glowing softly under a single beam of light. But when she reached to open it, she always woke up. Lucille told herself it was just a room, just wood and nails and old insulation, but she knew better. It had become a container, not just for whatever James had placed inside, but for all the things they had never said to each other. It held the weight of years, of unmet expectations, of grief unspoken. Their marriage never fractured, but something in it curled inward like leaves in drought. They functioned, lived, existed side by side. But the intimacy that once existed between glances, between breath and gesture, had faded into pale echo. She loved him still. That had never changed, but it was a love steeped in melancholy now, wrapped in resignation. And the attic remained above them, unopened, unseen, and unbearably present. The autumn light changed slowly that year, the way it always did in Georgia, gradual and golden, filtering through the thinning branches like memory made visible. The maples behind the house turned burnt orange, then gold, then slowly released their leaves like long-held secrets. By then, Lucille had stopped tending the garden with the same vigor. The basil had gone to seed, the marigolds browned. Even the hydrangeas near the fence, which she usually deadheaded carefully, had begun to wither where they stood. She no longer moved with the same rhythm. Her days passed with a different weight, a more deliberate slowness. James was changing. It began so subtly she almost didn't notice. A groan when standing from the table. A hand pressed to his side after mowing a corner of the lawn. He'd wince when stretching for something on the top shelf, then wave it off when she asked. He said it was nothing, just age. "You know these old bones," he'd mutter, chuckling low in his throat, but the chuckle lacked warmth. It didn't reach his eyes. He took more naps. His appetite dulled. One day, she noticed his belt had moved to the last hole. Lucille had lived long enough with silence to recognize the things not being said, but she also knew James. He was not the kind of man to speak of pain unless it was unbearable. He could work through a fever, drive through a storm, build a fence with a twisted ankle. His quiet endurance had once comforted her. Now it unsettled her. She began watching him more closely. At dinner, he would push food around his plate. In the evenings, he stopped fixing the loose porch board he'd mentioned for months. Sometimes, she would find him staring into space for minutes at a time, lost in a thought he wouldn't share. His shoulders, once so square and certain, seemed to sag. She asked him to see a doctor. Once, then again. The third time, she told him she'd made an appointment. He didn't protest. That scared her more than anything. They drove to Lincoln on a Thursday morning. The waiting room was cold, despite the thermostat's claim otherwise, and painted in soft yellows meant to soothe. Lucille filled out the forms while James sat beside her, silent. She could feel the tension in his body, taut beneath his calm expression. When the nurse called his name, he stood and followed her with a nod, offering Lucille a faint smile before disappearing down the hallway. She waited. And waited. The clock ticked too loudly. The water cooler gurgled. A mother across the room read quietly to her toddler, the child's laughter cutting through the stillness like a chime. Lucille folded and unfolded a pamphlet on digestive health until the paper softened at the edges. When the doctor finally came out, his expression was composed but somber. They moved to a private room. The words came slowly, carefully, like stepping around glass. Pancreatic cancer. Advanced. Inoperable. Lucille sat still, not breathing, while time seemed to fold in on itself. She felt the air in the room thicken. The phrase repeated in her mind, senseless and heavy. When she looked at James, he only nodded. No surprise, no panic, just the quiet resignation of a man who had already made peace with the truth. The drive home passed in near silence. The cornfields were browning under the early frost, and the sun hung low in the sky as if reluctant to shine. Lucille stared out the window, gripping the edge of her coat. James drove with both hands on the wheel, knuckles pale, eyes forward. When they got home, he went straight to the bedroom. She stood in the kitchen, her hands still trembling, staring at the mug he'd left on the counter that morning. It was cold now, half full, ringed with faint coffee stains. She didn't cry, not then. In the days that followed, James refused further treatment. No chemotherapy, no surgeries, no hospital stays. He told her he didn't want his remaining time to be spent under fluorescent lights or hooked up to machines. He wanted to be in his own bed, to drink from his own cup, to hear the wind move through the trees behind their house. Lucille didn't argue. She couldn't. His voice held a gentle finality, and her love for him was too deep to turn that wish into a fight. So she became his caretaker. She read every booklet, called every number, stocked their cabinets with soft foods and painkillers and antiseptics. She kept a notebook with medication times, tracked his temperature, learned how to change bedding without waking him. She moved through her days like a nurse, efficient and quiet, but her heart ached with every motion. Their routine became small, measured. He slept more. His steps slowed. The porch swing sat still. The radio stayed off. He spoke less, and when he did, his words came slower. But sometimes, on good days, he would joke, quiet, dry remarks that reminded her of who he had been. He'd reach for her hand, let it linger. Those moments sustained her. One evening, as she helped him settle into his chair on the porch, the golden light of sunset washing his skin in warmth, he reached out and took her wrist gently. His grip was weaker now, but the weight of the gesture was unmistakable. His eyes met hers. There was something urgent in them, something deeply personal. "If something happens," he said, his voice thin and rasping, "don't go up there." It took her a moment to understand. Then she realized he meant the attic. She felt a coldness creep up her spine, not of fear, but a weight, of meaning. He didn't elaborate. He didn't look away. Lucille nodded. The words caught in her throat, but she said them anyway. She promised. That night, as she helped him into bed and turned out the light, he whispered something barely audible. She had to lean in to hear it. "I kept it for us," he said. "You might not understand, but I had to." She didn't sleep well that night. Her thoughts circled the ceiling, the hatch, his words. What could he have kept for them? What was so sacred it needed secrecy, even in his dying breath? The next week blurred. James weakened further. Some days he barely opened his eyes. Others, he held her hand for hours without speaking. Lucille stopped marking time by clocks or calendars. She measured it in breath, in touch, in the quiet hum of the house. One morning, before dawn had fully broken, he slipped away. No struggle, no sound, just a gradual softening, a last breath that didn't return. His hand, once so firm, now lay open in hers like a leaf that had finished falling. Lucille sat beside him for hours. She didn't call anyone at first. The world outside could wait. She brushed his hair back, whispered to him, held his hand until it cooled. Eventually, the calls were made. The arrangements followed. The funeral was modest. A few neighbors, one of his co-workers from the garage, a cousin from Alabama she barely remembered. The service was short, the pastor's words kind and respectful. She stood alone at the grave, the wind tugging at the edge of her coat as the casket lowered into the ground. She didn't cry. Not there. Not then. Grief had not yet found its shape. Back home, the house welcomed her with the strange emptiness that follows loss. His slippers by the door, his razor on the bathroom shelf, his favorite mug on the drying rack. Each object seemed to hum with absence, and above it all, the attic remained. She tried not to look at it. She poured herself into sorting his things. Clothes, books, tools. She folded, boxed, labeled. But every drawer she opened seemed to breathe him back into the room, his handwriting on an old envelope, the smell of cedar from his shaving kit. A shirt with one sleeve still faintly creased, but the attic was louder now, not in sound but in presence. It called to her. At night, she would find herself staring up at the hatch, her eyes tracing the edges in the low hallway light. She would wake from sleep with the sense that something had shifted above her head. Once, she dreamed of footsteps on the ceiling, soft and steady, and awoke with her heart pounding. The promise she had made to him pressed against her like a stone. She had said she wouldn't go up there, but each day the weight of that vow grew heavier. One evening, while sitting alone on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders, she whispered his name. The wind stirred the trees, and for a moment she imagined he was beside her. She closed her eyes and tried to feel the warmth of his presence, but it had faded into memory. What had he kept for them? Why the secrecy, even in death? She didn't know yet that the answer waited in that small square of ceiling above their lives. That, beyond the latch, behind the wood, his truth rested quietly, preserved, patient, and full of love. But soon she would find it, and everything would change. For 3 days after the funeral, Lucille moved through the house like a ghost. The silence was no longer soft or familiar. It was cavernous. Her footsteps seemed to echo more than before. The floorboards groaned under her weight, not with their usual memory, but with protest. She found herself tiptoeing through rooms she had walked confidently for decades, afraid to disturb the stillness James had left behind. She made coffee every morning and poured 2 cups by habit. She only remembered halfway to the porch that there was no one to hand the second one to. The cup would sit on the counter, cooling beside her, untouched, until noon. She couldn't yet bring herself to wash his mug. It still held the curve of his lip on its rim, a faint stain of his last use. The flannel shirts hanging in the laundry room still smelled like his skin. She pressed her face into one and stood there a long while, eyes open, not blinking. She spent her days trying to stay in motion. She sorted drawers, refolded towels, reorganized cabinets that didn't need reorganizing. She cleaned out the fridge, vacuumed corners, polished picture frames that were already spotless. But every task led her in a slow circle back to the same hallway, the same square in the ceiling, the same silence that pressed against her ribs. The attic. She thought she could ignore it. At first, she tried. She avoided the hallway altogether, finding alternate routes through the house, choosing to go through the kitchen to reach the bedroom instead of passing beneath the hatch. But the house wasn't big enough to keep that space out of sight for long. Eventually, her eyes would drift upward. The cord would swing faintly in a draft, and the weight of what it concealed would settle on her shoulders again. She had made a promise. She had said the words aloud, with James's fading fingers wrapped around her wrist. But now that he was gone, the promise felt less like a pact and more like a tether, holding her back from something she didn't understand but could no longer ignore. What could he have possibly hidden that mattered so much? Why, in all their years together, had he never trusted her with the truth? On the fourth night, she woke with a start. It was still dark, the window panes rattling gently in the wind. She sat up in bed and felt it. Something in the house had shifted. Not physically, not something she could point to, but in the air. The weight had changed. She walked barefoot into the hallway, her nightgown brushing her ankles, and stood beneath the attic hatch. The cord hung still. She stared up at it for a long time, heart pounding, breath shallow before turning away. She told herself it was grief playing tricks, that the attic had always been there, that it would be there tomorrow and the next day, but sleep didn't return. The next morning, she lingered over her coffee, staring out the kitchen window, the backyard blurred behind her tears. For the first time in days, she whispered to the emptiness, "Why did you keep me out?" Later that afternoon, as she returned the clean linens to the bedroom closet, her hand brushed against a stack of envelopes in the nightstand. Most were old bills, folded instructions, scraps of scribbled notes. One, though, was different. It was unmarked, sealed, tucked beneath a stack of receipts. Something about its placement felt deliberate. She sat down on the edge of the bed and opened it with fingers she had to force to stay steady. Inside was a key. Small, brass, cold to the touch. Lucille stared at it in her palm. Her breath caught in her throat. It was unmistakably meant for the attic padlock. She closed her hand around it and sat there a long while, the weight of it burning into her skin. She didn't go up right away. That night, she left the key on the kitchen table and went to bed without touching it again. She told herself she needed to wait. That promises mattered. But in truth, she was afraid, not of what she might find, but of what it would do to her once she knew. The next morning, she woke before the sun. The sky outside was still gray, the house still cloaked in a soft blue hush. She moved on instinct, slipping into one of James's old flannel shirts, the sleeves rolled up clumsily past her wrists. She didn't bother with shoes. The hardwood felt cool and familiar under her bare feet. The house was quiet as she crossed through the kitchen. The key lay on the table where she had left it, its metal glinting faintly in the pale light. She picked it up, holding it tightly, as though it might escape if she let her grip slacken. In the hallway, she stood beneath the hatch and looked up. For years, she had walked past this spot without touching the cord. Now, she reached for it. The ladder came down with a soft creak, dust fluttering through the air like old breath. She climbed slowly. Each step moaned under her weight, but the wood held. When her head rose above the edge of the opening, she hesitated, heart racing, mouth dry. Then she stepped up into the attic. The air was warmer than she expected and dry. It smelled of old wood, of dust, of something sweet beneath it all, like paper and distant sunlight. Narrow windows on either side of the gable let in thin beams of morning light. She blinked, letting her eyes adjust. Then she saw them. They were everywhere. Portraits, dozens of them, maybe more. Children, painted, sketched, sometimes with pencil, sometimes in pastel, others in acrylic, detailed and vivid, each one unique. Some smiling, some solemn, some with curly hair, others with soft waves or tight braids. Some had dimples. Some had freckles. Many bore eyes so familiar, so distinctly hers, that she had to catch her breath. Lucille walked slowly between them, as if afraid to wake them. They hung on the slanted walls, propped on easels, leaned against crates and old furniture. They lined the attic like silent witnesses. Boys and girls, babies and toddlers, children of every imagined age. And not one of them was real. Except they were. In James's brushstrokes, they had lived. She reached out to touch a frame and stopped herself. Her hand trembled. On the back wall, in larger letters painted with care, were the words, "For us." Her knees buckled. She sat down on the floor, heart thudding. She looked around the room, at the drawings, the careful arrangement, the soft toys tucked into corners, the worn blanket folded beside an old wooden chair. In the far corner stood a crib. Real, hand-built, sanded, smooth, and painted white. The paint had chipped in places, revealing the wood beneath. Inside, a small elephant made of fabric sat propped against the pillow. Its eyes were buttons. One ear sagged. Lucille's breath hitched. She pressed a hand to her chest. She didn't know how long she sat there. Eventually, she rose and stepped toward the wall. Beneath one of the drawings, a girl with 2 afro puffs and a toothy grin, was a name written in careful, deliberate script. Maya. Next to her, another, Isaiah, then Joel, then Marcus. Each name was different, each child distinct, and every one of them lived only here. On the floor beside the crib lay a sketch pad, the pages filled edge to edge. She picked it up. Inside were drawings of a baby crawling, of a toddler holding a block, of a child in her mother's lap. Some scenes were of a little boy sitting in James's workshop, watching him hammer nails. Others showed a girl in a library, holding a picture book, her face wide with delight. There were dates scribbled in the corners, imagined birthdays, notes in the margins. Lucille closed her eyes. Tears began to fall, soft at first, then harder. She covered her mouth with her hand, the sound of her sobs muffled but unrelenting. She sank to her knees beside the crib, the notebook clutched to her chest. All these years, James had kept this. Not from cruelty, not from shame, but from heartbreak. He had built a world where their children had existed, if only in imagination. He had painted their lives, their faces, their joys. He had loved them into being when life had denied them the chance. And he had done it alone. She wept not just for the children they had never had, but for the man who had carried that sorrow in silence, who had turned it into something beautiful, hidden away in the rafters of their lives. When her tears slowed, Lucille looked around the attic again. It no longer felt like a forbidden place. It felt like James, like his hands, like his steady breath, like his unspoken grief. She reached out and touched the elephant in the crib. Its fabric was soft beneath her fingertips. Then she sat back, closed the sketchbook gently, and whispered into the stillness, "I see them." The attic didn't respond, but the light seemed a little warmer, and for the first time in days she didn't feel alone. The attic, once a sealed mystery, had become a sanctuary. Lucille returned the next morning without hesitation. She brought a cup of coffee with her, still hot, and climbed the ladder slowly, as if entering a sacred place that demanded quiet reverence. The light filtering through the narrow windows was softer today, less stark. Dust moved in slow spirals in the air, catching the beams like tiny ghosts drifting between portraits. She walked with more purpose now, studying the drawings with the eyes of someone newly fluent in a language she had once feared to speak. She knew these children weren't real, but they felt real, not in the skin and bone sense, but in the way memories feel real even when you know they're stitched from longing. She whispered their names, Maya, Isaiah, Joel, testing the weight of each one in her mouth, letting them settle like prayer. As she moved further into the space, her eyes fell on a stack of notebooks beside the crib. They were old-school spiral-bound types, the covers worn, some pages curling at the edges. She knelt and picked up the top one. The blue cover had faded, the metal spiral rusted in places. She opened it to the first page. At the top, written in blocky, deliberate letters, were the words, "Diary of a Father. For you, my child, if you ever find this." Her breath caught. She sat down slowly, cross-legged on the wooden floor, and began to read. The first entries were tentative, like someone testing their voice in a dark room. He described building the crib with his own hands, how the wood had split once and how he'd sanded it smooth anyway, determined to make it perfect. He wrote of his fears, not just of parenthood, but of believing too much in something that might never come. "I needed to do something with my hands," he wrote. "Something to hold hope." Lucille turned the pages, each one revealing more of the hidden man she had lived beside for decades. James wrote to their child, sometimes as a daughter, sometimes as a son, sometimes as a presence unnamed. He imagined their first words, their laugh, the weight of them asleep on his chest. He described bedtime stories he would have read, advice he would have given, lessons about kindness and courage and how to fix a squeaky hinge. One entry read, "Your mother planted sunflowers today." She looked tired. I wanted to tell her I still believe, but the words caught in my throat. So I came up here instead and wrote them to you. The tears came again, unbidden but softer this time. Not from shock, not from raw grief, but from the slow, aching release of understanding. James had not hidden this attic from her out of secrecy, but out of protection. It had been his way of carrying the weight, of transmuting their shared sorrow into something tangible. Where she had gone silent, he had built a world. In another entry, dated roughly 10 years earlier, he described a dream he'd had. He was teaching a little boy to ride a bike down the gravel path behind the house. The boy had fallen twice, skinned his knee, but got up smiling. "I woke up with my heart aching," he wrote. "I almost told your mother, I should have, but then I thought maybe this dream is just for me." Lucille pressed her fingers to the page, the indentations of his pen still raised slightly in the paper. She could almost hear his voice. As she read on, the entries became more vivid. He documented imaginary birthdays with homemade cakes, trips to the park, scraped knees, and lost teeth. He named the children different names at different times: Elena, Joshua, Grace, Dorian. There was no consistency, and yet each name carried a life of its own. Sometimes he described them as infants, sometimes as teenagers with their own moods and voices. He gave them preferences. Grace liked peaches, Dorian hated the cold. Elena wanted to be a teacher. Joshua loved dogs. She came across an entry that shook her. "I know you'll never read this, but maybe writing it helps me believe you existed, even if only in this room, even if only in me." Lucille closed the notebook, holding it against her chest. The ache was deep, but it was no longer hollow. It was full of the love he had poured into every line, full of the ache of what they had missed and the beauty of what he had made anyway. She reached for the next notebook and began again. This one was thinner, but just as rich. He had pasted in tiny photographs cut from magazines, pictures of children playing, smiling, sleeping. Between the images, he'd written captions as though narrating a family album. "Your first tooth," he wrote under a baby with drool on its chin. "Learning to swim beneath a toddler in floaties. Reading with Mom, next to a child holding a book larger than their face." In the corner of one page, he had written, "Sometimes I imagine you asking me why I made all this, I think I'd tell you, because I had nowhere else to put the love." Lucille stayed in the attic for hours. The light changed around her, but she didn't notice. She moved from notebook to notebook, reading the layers of his hope, his sorrow, his resilience. He had never stopped writing, even as his body must have begun to betray him. His handwriting grew shakier, the letters more cramped, but the entries never stopped. One of the final notebooks, with a plain brown cover and torn spine, contained a handful of entries written with difficulty. She had to squint to read them. "You won't know me. Not really," one began. "But I knew you. I knew every inch of you, even if I never saw your face. I heard your laugh in the wind. I imagined the grip of your hand around my finger. You were mine. And I'm sorry I couldn't make you real." Lucille sat perfectly still after reading it, the words ringing through her like a bell struck in her chest. Her hand trembled as she closed the cover. There was no signature. Just the date, scribbled in a nearly illegible hand, 3 weeks before he died. It was then that she realized the attic was not just a refuge. It was a monument, a testament, not to tragedy, but to the depth of a man's capacity to love without limit, to carry a dream for decades and give it space to live, even in secret. Her grief shifted in that moment. It didn't vanish, but it found shape. She stood slowly and moved around the attic again. Everything looked different now. The toys weren't decorations, the blankets weren't props. The room had been alive with intention. Each object had been placed, chosen, held. Every sketch was a conversation, every drawing a heartbeat. She traced the edge of a wooden train set, picked up a crayon drawing pinned to the beam. Childlike and bright, a stick figure family beneath a lopsided sun. Above it, in large letters, it read, "For Mom and Dad, I love you." She wept again, but the tears came like rain after drought. Later, when she descended the ladder and returned to the kitchen, she felt something in her had settled. The house no longer felt empty. It felt inhabited, not by ghosts, but by love. That evening, as the sky burned orange beyond the trees, she returned to the attic once more. Not as a visitor, as its keeper. She brought a small broom, a clean cloth, a jar of lemon oil. She dusted shelves, wiped frames, straightened the mobile above the crib. She opened the windows to let in fresh air. She folded the worn blanket and set it gently in the cradle. She moved with tenderness and purpose, as if caring for something still growing. Before she left, she placed the notebooks back in a neat stack and sat on the rocker in the corner, one that creaked familiarly beneath her weight. She watched the light fade through the slats in the walls, the room painted in amber and shadow. She didn't need answers anymore. She had found the truth, and it was enough. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a fresh notebook, blank, new, the pages crisp. She opened to the first page and began to write. "My name is Lucille, and today I met the children I never had, but they were never strangers, because they lived here, in him, in this room, and now, in me." The attic was quiet, but it felt full. The days began to stretch out again, not in the numb and endless way they had in the weeks after James's death, but in the way they used to, when life was quietly full and marked by simple routines. Lucille rose early now, as the light was just beginning to creep through the curtains. She still made coffee for 2, though the second cup now traveled with her into the attic. It had become her place, just as it had once been his. But where James had used it as a refuge for sorrow and imagined hope, Lucille was shaping it into something else, something shared. Each morning, barefoot and wrapped in a soft shawl, she climbed the attic stairs with her coffee in one hand and a notebook in the other. The creak of the ladder no longer startled her. It welcomed her. The room felt lived in, not dusty or distant, and the quiet had softened. It was no longer the silence of grief, but of reverence, the hush of a sacred place. The air smelled faintly of paper and pine, touched by the breeze she let in through the little side windows. She sat in the same rocking chair James must have used beside the crib and read through his words again and again. And then she began adding her own. She picked up where he left off, writing entries addressed to the children they never had, to the ones who had lived in his heart and now lived in hers. Some entries were long, winding thoughts about the past or what might have been. Others were just a few lines, small confessions or quiet revelations. Sometimes she wrote about her day, about the squirrels that had returned to the maple tree by the porch, about the new recipe she tried that didn't quite turn out, about how the light looked different in the late afternoon now that summer was approaching. Other times, she wrote as if she were telling stories to a child on her knee. She described herself as a young woman, full of ambition, moving to a quiet town for love. She described James with loving clarity, never omitting his silences or his stubborn ways, but always returning to the deep, patient love that shaped everything he did. She no longer cried when she entered the attic. Her grief had changed shape. It was still present, still tender, but no longer sharp. It had woven itself into her routines, a quiet undercurrent that moved through everything she did. She swept the floor each Saturday. She brought fresh flowers from the yard and placed them in a chipped ceramic cup beside the crib. She began reading aloud from the picture books James had collected, softly, slowly, letting the words settle into the space as if someone were listening. As spring edged into summer, the community began to stir again, and Lucille found herself slowly rejoining it. She began walking into town more often, lingering at the farmer's market to pick out peaches and fresh tomatoes. One morning, while she was picking through a bundle of green beans, a young mother beside her juggled a squirming toddler and a bag of produce. Without thinking, Lucille reached out and steadied the child as he nearly slipped from his mother's hip. The mother gave her a grateful smile. Lucille smiled back, something inside her shifting gently. Later that week, the director of the library called and asked if she might be willing to help with the children's story hour during the summer months. Their usual volunteer had moved away, and they needed someone kind, someone steady. Lucille hesitated only a moment before agreeing. That night, she returned to the attic and pulled one of James's old notebooks from the shelf. She read a few passages by the window, then gently closed the cover and said aloud, "I think you'd want this." She spent hours preparing, reading through the very books James had once placed in this room. She made notes, marked favorite pages. On the day of the first story hour, she dressed carefully and arrived early. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the book and faced a semicircle of bright-eyed children. But as she began to read, their attention wrapped around her like a warm blanket. Their laughter filled the room, loud and unfiltered, and for the first time in years, Lucille laughed with them. Not a polite smile, not a muted chuckle, but a deep, breathless laugh that left her blinking back tears for a different reason. She began spending more time at the library. Then, quietly, she reached out to the local foster agency. At first, she helped behind the scenes, sorting donated clothes, organizing shelves, cleaning playrooms. But soon, she was asked to help with visitation days, sitting with children while they waited for appointments, reading to them, helping them with puzzles or homework. She didn't talk much at first, but the children didn't seem to mind. They responded to her calm presence, the way she knelt to look them in the eye, the way she remembered their names and their favorite books. Some were quiet and cautious, others noisy and full of restless energy. All of them were hungry for attention, for safety, for something they couldn't quite name. Lucille gave what she could: a steady hand, a soft word, a lap to sit on. And in return, they gave her something she didn't realize she'd been longing for: a place to send the love that James had kept hidden in the attic for all those years. She didn't speak to anyone about what she had found upstairs. It was hers now, and his, and theirs. It didn't need explanation. One afternoon, while cleaning the attic, Lucille discovered a small wooden box tucked behind the bookshelf. She hadn't seen it before, and it was covered in a layer of soft dust. She opened it gently and found dozens of folded slips of paper. Each one bore a name, some ordinary, some whimsical, and on the reverse a description. Orion asks too many questions. Lena, quiet laugh. Cypress, always barefoot. It was as if James had imagined 1,000 different children and given each one a place in his heart. She spread the slips out across the attic floor, touching each one with trembling fingers. Then she gathered them into a glass jar and placed it beside the crib. A constellation of children never born, but never forgotten. That night, she brewed a cup of chamomile tea and sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. The jar of names glowed in the attic window, lit by the soft lamp she'd placed there. The barn swallows sang their last notes, and the cicadas began their slow chorus. The world felt still, but not empty. On the kitchen table lay a letter from the foster agency, inviting volunteers to join a summer picnic for the children. There would be games and food and a lazy river to wade in. They needed extra hands. Lucille picked up a pen and added her name to the list. She slept easily that night and dreamed of James, not as he had been in his final days, but as he had been in the beginning. Strong, silent, eyes full of quiet light. In the dream, he stood beside her in the attic, one hand resting on the crib, the other on her shoulder. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She felt everything in the way his hand lingered. A week later, a traveling puppet theater arrived in the town square. It was the sort of event she and James might once have passed by on an evening walk, pausing just long enough to smile at the sound of laughter before continuing on. This time, she walked directly into the crowd, found a spot on the grass among the families, and sat cross-legged, arms around her knees. The puppets danced and tumbled across the tiny stage, and the children giggled and squealed in delight. Halfway through the show, a small boy with tousled hair and no shoes left his group and, without a word, climbed into her lap. He leaned back against her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Lucille didn't move. She simply wrapped her arms around him and watched the show. When it ended, the boy ran back to his group. He didn't look back, but Lucille remained where she was, hands folded quietly, heart full in a way that surprised her. It wasn't joy, not exactly. It was presence. It was peace. That evening, she returned to the attic, lit the small lamp, and sat in her rocker. She opened her notebook to a blank page. "You never lived in this house," she wrote. "Not in the way we dreamed. But you lived in him. And now you live in me. You were loved. You are loved. That makes you real." The attic held its silence, and the stars appeared one by one outside the narrow window. Lucille closed her notebook and set it gently on the shelf beside his. She sat a while longer, wrapped in the hush, the soft creak of the chair beneath her, the steady rhythm of her own breathing. and when she finally stood and turned out the light, the room felt not like an ending, but like the beginning of something else. Something wide and full of light. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our next video and discover even more powerful stories. And if this touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it.